Are we about to see Wikipedia somehow blocked from working in the UK or something in response to this? What's going on?
They're worried that a British regulator could take loads of the revenue. Of course they're worried. It's shareholder value. It's a crazy idea from government.
The really obvious problem with that is that it creates a huge disincentive for anyone else to invest. Right? If people think you're going to walk away with their profits or confiscate their assets, they're not going to build up that wealth in this country.
Broadening the VAT out. And now that's an interesting way, a perhaps less damaging solution, but would require much more radical thinking.
You could do it so much you could actually drop a few pence off VAT, but they probably would have to broaden it out really extensively, just not to raise it.
From CapX, this is The Capitalist. I'm Marc Sidwell, and my guests today are Henry Hill, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, and Maxwell Marlow, Director of Public Affairs at the Adam Smith Institute. Wikipedia has found itself in the crosshairs of the UK's new Online Safety Act, losing a legal bid to overturn regulations it says could endanger the rights and safety of its volunteer editors. At the heart of the dispute is a rule that could require the site to verify the identities of its contributors, a measure the Wikimedia Foundation argues is overly broad and ill-suited to a platform with no advertising and a strict ban on adult content. Is it yet another drastic misunderstanding of how the internet works? Maxwell, are we about to see Wikipedia somehow blocked from working in the UK or something in response to this? What's going on?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting story, which is that the Wikimedia Foundation attempted to use JR, Digital Review, to basically overturn or exempt themselves from the Online Safety Act. And this is to do with one of the parts of the Online Safety Act, which is to do with whether or not they're a Class 1 service, which means that either in the first condition they have recommended content, so an algorithm that recommends content, and secondly, whether or not they have 34 million users in the UK, which apparently they don't. So it was thrown out of court for that reason. But if it were to be the fact that that they become a Class 1 service provider, of which I think there are about 11 in the UK, then that conversation would have to happen. And the court did say that just because they've thrown out this JR doesn't mean that it gives a green light to Peter Kyle, the Secretary of State in charge of this legislation, to go, all ham, essentially go out and regulate the rest of the sector as if everything was a Class 1. So it's a bit of a slap on the wrist for the government, but isn't that victory that a lot of us on the kind of free speech bracket were really looking for here?
Max, do you think this is just the start of more problems to come, for not just for Wikimedia, but for profit-making tech firms as well, who are going to be facing even stricter regulations as the Online Safety Act continues to roll out, because it's only just begun the process of rolling out?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in phase 2, and there's lots more to come. But I think when you talk about the money being potentially raised from this through punitive fines, it's what I'd actually call it banditory. It's either, multi-million pound fine or up to 10% of global revenue. So let's look at Meta, for example. So 10% of Meta's revenue, which I've written down here if I can find what I wrote, is £8.9 billion. And that covers, that covers the entirety of DEFRA's budget. So imagine if you had a few of these, Meta, and then you had, maybe Reddit or whatever else. We're talking, huge swathes of government revenue purely from this sort of banditry. So I'm a bit worried about this fundamentally, that, Ofcom could get quite jumpy with its own rules, as if, big tech chooses not to stand up for itself, which I'm sure it will. But, an unnamed, DCIT individual who, was reported in the press said, oh, we shouldn't be too worried. This is just big tech shaking, rattling its sabers. They're worried that a British regulator could take loads of the revenue. Of course they're worried. It's shareholder value. It's a crazy, idea from government.
Henry, you can see why the government might be interested in ways that it can find a few billion, given the state of the public finances. But do you think this banditry, as Max calls it, is going to work out for them, or is it just going to drive the tech companies away?
Well, you look at the way this always pans out, right? Like, it's always potentially possible, if you've got a country with lots of people having assets in it, to seize those assets as a one-off payday. But the problem with that, the really obvious problem with that, is that it creates a huge disincentive for anyone else to invest, right? If people think you're going to walk away with their profits or confiscate their assets, they're not going to build up that wealth in this country. So it is very much a case of avoiding difficult decisions today by bashing an easy target and trying to scrape some revenue off them at the expense of further undermining the long-term viability of the British economy at a time when that is the very last thing we can afford, because our revenue expenditure accounts are running way ahead of the tax take. The taxes are going to have to go up and up and up, not to make useful, productive investments that might lay the foundations for a better Britain, but just to cover ongoing costs. So it's really crushing that we are in a period in whatever crisis Britain is currently going through, where, in fairness to the politicians, there isn't a lot of public acceptance of the fact that there needs to be a massive systemic shift in how much we spend in government, but therefore governments are scrambling around to try and find what money they can. We're cutting and cutting and cutting, and we're not just cutting capital investment like new hospitals, new roads, railways, etc. We don't have a functional court system. We don't have enough prison places to send people to prison. The military is largely non-deployable. And now, having really not trimmed the fat, as George Osborne said, but really cut to the bone in terms of large parts of the state, what are we doing now? We're looking to try and loot some of the biggest companies in the world. I think Max probably just mentioned that the fines are levied on their global revenue. It's an absolutely absurd power grab, and of course it's going to come back to bite them, because functionally, at the end of the day, Britain is just not that big a market, right? If the risks of regulation exceed the value of the market, the company will pull out.
Well, we'll come on to some of the tax issues that you were talking about there, Henry, in a little bit. But let's just stay on the online safety topic for now and move on to the politics of it. Marc Andreessen, the Silicon Valley power broker and co-founder of Andreessen Horowitz, has joined the backlash, and he's taken his grievances straight to Downing Street. The billionaire investor, who also sits on Meta's board, reportedly urged Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer to rein in Peter Kyle after the technology secretary suggested critics of the law were aligning themselves with sex offenders. But there's little chance of that happening, since it seems that line came straight from Downing Street, and that's because these lines are seen as politically useful. Max, turn to you on this. It seems like the public is very much still behind the Online Safety Act. There are people who are angry about it, but it seems if you look at the polling, there seems to be something that Labour are thinking, that they're going to win the battle of public opinion on this, and that it may even be a useful attack line against reform who have lined up against it. How do you think the politics of this are really going to play out?
Well, specifically on the Jimmy Savile line, which was what Marc Andreessen was referencing, actually, if you look at YouGov polling, most people think it's quite despicable that they've used such a line. And the two things are not at all incongruent. So I don't think that's going to keep working. However, as we know from all sorts of legislation, whether it's, the relitigation of zombie knives through to the smoking ban, through to, 10 mile per hour zones in Wales, right? It's all about save the kids. So that's going to keep on working quite well until, these tech companies or people in the kind of the freedom fighting movement, as I'd call it, get smart about how they do their polling and ask the right questions. Because you can ask the public of any opinion, so I could go out and say, do you want us to save the kids? Everyone will say yes, obviously. And then I could say, well, how about paying £10,000 of your lost, gross value add, or however you'd phrase it? They'd probably go, we'll be a little bit more cautious about that, or, talking about other second order consequences. So it's all about how you phrase these questions, and deploying polling like that. That's always been the case. So I'd be surprised if they keep using these sorts of lines, especially if it annoys people like Marc Andreessen, Elon Musk, or even JD Vance. And as we know from the Starmer meeting in the Oval Office a few months ago, Washington is really alive to this issue about freedom of speech in the UK. And with such large fines on the Online Safety Act, no wonder tech companies are getting a little bit dicey about what they allow on their platform in terms of content provided. Fundamentally, I don't think this act is an assault on freedom of speech directly, but I think what it does is it erodes the public square, and you cannot have freedom of speech without the public square. And I think that's why, groups like companies like X have been quite nervous to put on videos such as those by Katie Lamb in the House of Commons talking about the grooming gangs, Neil O'Brien talking about TFR, total fertility rate, or even videos of protests in the UK on such matters. So I really do think it's about public square erosion, and big tech obviously being quite nervous about Ofcom coming for their coffers.
Henry seems to have frozen there for a moment. Max, if I can come to you, given the authoritarian nature of the British public these days, which Henry was just talking about, Do you think that Reform have made a misstep by lining themselves up so squarely against the Online Safety Act? I mean, they're saying they're going to repeal it. I think they're the only party that's gone that far. The Tories obviously were very much the ones who brought it in. Do you think that's going to bite them at the ballot box?
I mean, I don't think so at all. I mean, it's not really an electoral promise, to be honest. I think what's interesting, I heard from people in CCHQ talking to MPs saying that, the reason why the Conservative Party is so reticent to speak up about, the real overreach of the bill is because many MPs of the last Parliament saw it as the crown jewel of the 2019-24 Conservative government, which I think is absolutely baffling, and obviously didn't win them any votes by getting it through. So I don't think it's a misstep in that sense. And it's also how Reform are spinning this now, which is that it's a battle for free speech, and there's something I think has become more prominent in the mind of the public. So I think that's really what they're talking about, the blob, big state, oppressing working people. That's how they're spinning it and doing quite a good job of it compared to how Labour are, and they're kind of speaking across each other. So they'll land in different audiences and both be as salient, respectively. So I think it should be a really interesting debate going forward, certainly. And I know last week you had Preston Byrne on, for example, who's the ASI's legal fellow and head of Byrne Storm in the US, who's trying to get Peter Kyle banned from the US as well as Melanie Dawes. He's been in conversations with the White House about that, and I wish all the best for Melanie and Peter, but I think this stuff sort of should have consequences, and we know from the White House they're willing to really stand up for American interests. And given these tech companies, they're all based in America, they're all based in Silicon Valley. Well,
we shall have to wait and see how that plays out. Let's turn now, finally today, to the topic of tax, which came up a little bit earlier. If there's one thing that most of us can agree on, it's that the UK's tax system is too complex. And now the Taxpayers Alliance has the detail to back that up. The latest edition of the TPA's Comprehensive Tax Briefing Room shows that over the last 2 years, our tax system has become even more burdensome and complicated than before. It's quite some feat. With income tax thresholds unchanged for 2 years, more and more are being dragged into higher rate tax. Particularly galling, of course, is the 40p rate for those earning just over £50,000, which is barely above the median London salary these days. But the burdens don't stop there. Stamp duty breaks for first-time buyers have been cut, air passenger duty has gone up, and inheritance tax reliefs have been trimmed. The list goes on. Meanwhile, low-tax hubs around the world, such as Dubai, continue to lure high earners with simplicity and clarity. But with the UK's debt and spending apparently out of control, is there any hope for a lower tax future? Maxwell, I mean, we're heading towards an autumn budget where everyone seems to think that taxes are going up. Is that all we have to look forward to?
Yep, I think so, unfortunately. They're going to bring the tax hammer down once more, and it's going to be very, very messy. They'll probably be looking at things like an exit tax, from what I can tell. I don't think they have the gumption to increase VAT or to increase, income tax or national insurance again. So the big hitters are going to have to remain. Likewise, corporation tax. I think there's enough calls in the city to say, don't you dare go near that, or we'll all just go for the door. So it's going to be stuff like an exit tax, I think. And there's really not much else you can do fundamentally. You can tweak around the side, but the NIESR's report about that over £40 billion black hole that's staring the Chancellor down the barrel, that's going to have to be dealt with. And I also don't think they've got the gumption to start cutting, as we saw with the welfare reforms U-turn. So all of this stuff is very, very worrying. No doubt bond markets will be in a frenzy ahead of the autumn statement. So let's see what happens there. But the TPA's resource is absolutely brilliant. I've used it for a long time. I know lots of friends in policy world use it. Politicians use it. Really great to see they've updated it in such great detail. But, it does just show you we need a really much more simplified tax system. And unfortunately, to put a few accountants out of work or tax lawyers, because we have this system which, this huge part of the economy which grows on the back of this tax system that, most people can't even begin to comprehend.
Well, as you say, most people can't really begin to comprehend it. So let's just unpick a couple of things you were saying there. It's very interesting. Could you just explain for listeners what you mean by an exit tax and what's dangerous about that, or what's wrong with that?
Absolutely. So an extra tax is essentially thievery. So what happens is if you have assets in the UK, you want to move to one of the nice low tax jurisdictions such as, I don't know, the United States or Dubai or Monaco or Andorra or wherever else, you will be made to pay basically your tax bill on capital gains tax or any surplus taxes that you won't be paying elsewhere. If you were staying in the UK. So it was described to me once by someone who's advocating for it as stopping dine and dash, if you're familiar with the term. So, you've come to the restaurant of Britain, you've chosen from an a la carte menu of, high human capital and the English legal system and whatever else. And then you've decided to eat all of your food, made all of your money, and then you leave without paying. So people want you to pay the bill on the way out, completely ignoring the fact you pay ginormous amounts of tax in the UK if you're starting and running a business, including all the people you hire, all the corporation tax you pay, etc., etc., etc. So people want that to basically put in. It's got two big issues. One is that people will be steaming toward the door by the time it's announced and heading out, and it'll be challenged in the courts if they try to apply it retroactively. So good luck getting your money back then by the time everyone's left. We've got evidence of this, by the way, in Germany. One of the German states tried to put in an exit tax for the day afterwards. Overnight, about 8,000 people left for Switzerland. Quite surprise. The second big thing you've got is actually foregoing future revenue. People won't want to move to the UK and start businesses and invest and create all that growth if they know that if things go badly and they want to leave, that they'll be stung with a huge tax bill at the end. So it stops people from moving here in the first place. So it is a terrible, terrible idea. But as we know, the Treasury aren't adverse to such warnings often. So it could definitely be coming down the line.
Alas, alas. And of course, one of the problems with the UK tax system, which I'm sure we've talked about with you before and others on this show, is that it's very narrow in its tax base. It relies a lot on the amount paid by very wealthy people who are the sort of people who are affected by a tax like that. You mentioned another idea, which was broadening the VAT out. And now that's an interesting way, a perhaps less damaging solution, but would require much more radical thinking. Could you explain a little bit about that and what that would involve?
Sure. So of all the goods and services in the UK that we pay VAT for, only about 50% that we buy in the economy, only about 50% is taxed by VAT. There are huge exemptions out there, and it can go all the way from very contentious and actually I'd say quite damaging placement of VAT on private schools, all the way through to books and babies' clothes and chocolate and stuff like that. It's very, very confusing. So Tom Clougherty, who's used to be at CPS and also the ASI, now at the IEA, has always been whenever you sit down and chat to Tom about tax, which is very enjoyable, his first thing is broaden out that VAT base. You could do it so much you could actually drop a few pence off VAT, but they probably would have to broaden it out really extensively, just not to raise it. So it's a really big thing you could do. It massively increases compliance. Obviously, it stops fancy tax barristers from making a million things. I once went to a roundtable dinner, sat next to the tax lawyers who were responsible for such great things as exempting certain types of poppadoms from VAT. It was a riveting evening, let me tell you, Mark. It was fantastic. But they took great joy in this because it's they're playing with the system. They got paid lots of money to do it, etc. So there's stuff like that which we should just get rid of and just apply a base rate to everything, and that does make sense. The problem is though, it can be inflationary because if you're then putting another 20% on 50% of all the things we buy, guess what? Prices will go up. Retailers pay the tax. We pay the tax to retailers. They collect it. Producers don't, so they'll just have to absorb the cost somehow. So it could be quite inflationary, which is really bad news for for living standards and for the cost of living crisis.
Well, that's an exciting idea. I guess it's one we're not going to see, as you say, from Labour. And they've certainly shown, as I think Henry was saying earlier, that spending cuts are something that they're not really able to do either. So they're sort of stuck in a bind. We're going to get higher taxes from them. We may not even see that much more in the way of revenue because, of course, we're already at unprecedented levels of tax revenue. You can put up the rates, you don't necessarily get more in. But what about the prospects for any other party that might come through? Reform again. Now they have talked about significant tax cuts, but also significant spending cuts in an effort to do that. But at the same time, their voting base is perhaps not that keen on the spending cuts if they thought about it. Do you think they're going to be able to come up with a new model that will cut through electorally and actually do something about the state of the fiscal mess we're in?
We'll have to see, really. But, we have a cakeist electorate, so you can have your cake and eat it. And I think that we need to get to a crisis point fundamentally. I really don't want this at all, but we need to get to the point where actually, oh my God, we can't raise any more revenue or whatever. So I think a big one for me in this area are water companies. Right, so we've got this. There are rumours going as we record today about Thames Water becoming insolvent. Zara Sultana, of course, is out there saying we should nationalise water, make it fairer, bring bills down. It's not how it works. So someone's got to pay to repair all the waterways and pay for those new reservoirs. And you've got two options: you've got bill payers, or you've got private creditors who will want to see those bonuses at the end and those dividends. And if we nationalise it, it will be taxpayers and bill payers paying for the privilege. And I think that sort of honest conversation needs to happen, because at the moment, the media landscape around this is just totally distorted. So I think it's incumbent upon the media class, but also the political class, to turn around to people and go, sorry, no, there's no more money left. Although if you saw Rob Colville's tweets earlier today and yesterday about MMTers, I mean, they'll just tell her to print more money and it'll be absolutely fine. So, but we'll ignore those for now. So they need to have a really honest conversation with the electorate and just tell them, the bank account is unfortunately empty. Things need to start be cut back on.
Well, sadly, we'll have to continue to wait for an honest conversation with the electorate. That doesn't seem to be on anyone's manifesto. But we'll have to leave it there. Maxwell, Marlow and Henry Hill, who's had to drop off, thank you. Make sure you're subscribed to our daily email briefings. Go to capx.co. That's capx.co. I'm Mark Sidwell. Goodbye.